Okay, recording now. How the advertising behind television really changed with this going from the solo sponsorship to multiple sponsors. But still, the sponsorship model is something that even today, we certainly on broadcast television and cable television, but even if it's not a 30-second commercial. I think the last thing we discussed on Friday was the idea of product placement and how subtle it is, or maybe it's not so subtle, but the fact, we showed that picture of Breaking Bad and Walter White walking past a Coke machine. I mean, we all walk past Coke machines, and if you're walking around campus and you walk into a building, chances are there's a Coke machine. So it's just kind of second nature to us, or it's something that we don't even notice anymore. And we might not really pay attention to it in a TV show because, again, it looks more normal than if a character is walking by a vending machine that just says soda or pop or something like that. But still, it is product placement, and that is still a very prevalent type of advertising, certainly in TV shows and in film as well. And even more so, and I don't even want to say today because this has been going on for 10 or 20 years, probably even longer, because I can go back to my Nintendo Entertainment System I had in the late 80s and early 90s, and there were product placement in video games, and there's still product placement in video games today. So still a very successful and prominent type of advertising in all forms of media content. All right, we are transitioning now to Chapter 4. And as you can see, we're getting a little bit, everything they talked about in that framework in Chapter 2 in a general sense, we're getting into a more specific sense with each of these chapters. So Chapter 4 is going to be about regulations. And these are the laws, the guidelines, and policies, as you can see here, that govern how media produce, distribute, and exhibit products. So the produce and the distribute, but even exhibit. And exhibit means, to display them, aggregate them. And now we're talking about the rules behind when and where and how you can show a movie or a recent episode of a television show. So all of these regulations come into play with each step of creating a piece of media content or a media text. So Chapter 4 deals with all the regulations, and most of this chapter is going to be devoted to, well, I'd say about half and half. Half of this chapter is going to be devoted to how the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, regulates TV, specifically broadcast TV, but also elements of cable as well. Maybe not the elements you're thinking of, maybe not the content, but they certainly regulate elements of cable. And then the movie rating system. So why is something PG? Why is something PG-13? Why is something R? So about half and half on each of these, but both of those fall under the more general topic of regulations. And with each chapter that we're going to discuss here, you got to ask yourself 3 questions as we proceed. Who does the regulating? So as I just said, in most cases, especially when it comes to TV, it's the FCC. With movies, it's the Motion Picture Association of America. What is regulated? Well, certainly content, right? We know there are certain barriers that directors will cross that will make a PG-13 movie an R movie. And there have certainly been examples in history of directors that have had to cut scenes from movies to make something that is R down to PG-13 or make something that is NC-17 down to R. So oftentimes, content creators will regulate their own material because they know what has worked in the past. They often know better what separates a PG from a PG-13 movie. They know what they can get away with, what they can't get away with. So a lot of times the media content are self-regulated. And then how do regulations affect the products of media industries? Why is it important for a director who's been slapped with an NC-17 rating to edit down to an R? Well, most movie theaters aren't going to play NC-17 movies. You very, very rarely see that. Most commercial movie chains, cinema chains, they're not going to play anything that's rated higher than an R. So it certainly does affect the business model. If a director chooses to edit some questionable content in order to get a different rating for their movie. But let's go back. Start this chapter in 1948, the lovely year of 1948. And up until this point, the movie industry was controlled by, about 8 big movie studios, Paramount being one of the most powerful ones. And back in this day, the movie studio controlled everything, every aspect of filmmaking. So vertical integration. But you could also argue that the fact that the movie industry was controlled by these 8 companies, an example of horizontal integration as well. It would have been very difficult for an independent filmmaker to get their movie released without doing business with one of these 8 major movie studios. So there was both happening here. But small theaters, independent movie houses, actors, actresses, directors, they eventually had an issue with this, with the vertical integration part of these big movie studios. And when I say controlled every aspect, Paramount, just as an example, they had the directors and actors and actresses under contract. So if you were a director and you signed a contract with Paramount, you cannot work with any other movie studio unless you got out of your contract somehow. So if you were a director and you were signed to Paramount, you can only direct movies for Paramount. Same with actors and actresses. If you were under contract with Paramount, you cannot star in any other movie if it's being distributed by a different movie studio. But they also controlled all the editing, distribution, every facet of it. Construction folks who built the set, caterers, all of these were employees of the particular movie studio. And as you can probably already sense, this created some friction. If another movie studio had a great idea and for a movie or a great script, and they wanted a director who worked for Paramount to come over there and direct it, couldn't do it. Even if they would be willing to offer him more money. And as I said, oftentimes these movie studios they had their own theaters as well. So the production to the distribution to the aggregation, the movie actually getting into the theater and getting to the public. But there were some small independent movie theaters, and they had to do business with these big studios in order to show the movies. And the Paramounts of the world would allow small independent theaters to show their movies, but it came with a catch. Something called block booking. So if you ran a small independent movie theater and you wanted to show Paramount's new big blockbuster movie, they also made you show a couple of their smaller movies that they were fairly certain weren't going to raise much money. So for every one blockbuster that you got from Paramount, you had to get 3 or 4 what we would call today straight to DVD movies as well. And the movie houses didn't like that. And this ended up being an antitrust lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided for or against the movie studios. And they had to break up the monopolies that they had over every element of the movie making business. So since then, again, this is 1948, since then, actors, actresses, directors have been able to work with any studio. It eliminated block booking, so independent movie houses could negotiate the showing of one movie without having to show 3 or 4 others that they knew were going to be, or figured were going to be less successful. But don't worry about the movie industry in 1948. They made some changes. And one of the major changes they made was with that newfangled invention that was just coming down the pike in the late 40s and early 50s, TV. Movie studios said, well, you know what, if you're going to block us from doing business like we're used to doing, the block booking, the having actors and actresses and directors under contract, then we gotta figure out a way to still make a ton of money. So after TV's first couple of years, where they pretty much just played live content, live entertainment, variety shows and musical shows, once we got into the 1950s, the movie studios realized that they could make a good bit of money going into negotiations with TV networks about showing their movies, TV stations showing the movies of the big Paramounts and other movie studios once their run was over in a theater. So in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, once a movie was done with its initial run in the theater, it would go to DVD or VHS. In the early 50s, once a movie was done with its initial run in a theater, then Paramount would make a deal with NBC, ABC, and say, hey, pay us a lot of money and we'll let you show our movie a couple nights a week for a couple of months. Or on a Sunday afternoon when everyone's sitting at home. And TV was happy to do it. So got more ratings for them. And the movie studios were happy to do it because they got more money from the TV networks to make up for any income lost by the Supreme Court deciding against them in 48. And I think the movie industry, I think the movie industry has been fairly successful, not fairly successful, very successful over the past, 80 years or so, in that they've always been able to tell when the tide in technology is about to turn. Because in the early 50s, the movie industry knew that, hey, TV was probably going to hurt us. Because if you as a family wanted to watch people on a screen interact with one another, you had to go to the movies because you couldn't get that on radio. Then TV came along, you could watch people interact with each other, and you could do it in the privacy of your own home. So the movie industry knew they would be taking a hit with fewer families showing up at the cinema because they just decided, you know what, let's stay home and watch TV. So then they developed deals with television stations to let them air their movies once their runs were done in theaters. And you can also see how As broadcast TV turned into cable and movie theaters took other hits, movie theaters, there are pretty much cable stations now that just run movies. So the studios are still making big bucks off of those deals. And then the studios also had the foresight to look at VHS rentals in the 80s and DVDs in the 90s and 2000s. And the movie studio model has changed a bit, quite a bit, in that oftentimes today, movie studios are less concerned. I mean, they want to have a huge opening weekend, sure. But oftentimes they're less concerned about a huge opening day weekend in the theaters and more concerned about the deals they've made after the movie's initial run is over. And 30 years ago it was VHS, 20 years ago it was DVD, now it's Netflix, Hulu, Prime, international markets. Still TV too. But the movie studios have always been ahead of the game. They know they're at a bit of a disadvantage because it's expensive to go to the movies. And people have other entertainment options, especially in the comfort of their own homes. So the movie industry has been smart about that, ahead of the game. All right, so who regulates? Well, the state, the government. Usually governmental bodies in our country, it is the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. And the FCC itself, it's really just a 5-person board. I mean, there are lots of employees that work for the FCC, but the Federal Communications Commission itself is a 5-person body or 5-person board. It has a chair. The current chair is Ajit Pai.
Have you seen his big mug?
His Reese's? Yeah. He's a character. He's a character. But the thing about the FCC and it having 5 committee members, you can't have more than 3 from one political party. So Pai identifies as a Republican, and right now there are 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats that serve on the FCC. And as you can see, they regulate content, which I think we were all aware of. So since the broadcast networks belong to the public, broadcast stations have to make sure that whatever material they air is friendly to your average audience. It's not going to create a lot of controversy. Community standards, very important. So that means no excessive profanity, although what words have been determined profane has changed over the time, over the decades. I remember being shocked in the late 70s and early 80s when TV characters could start saying damn on the air. It's evolved a bit since then. But there are still those super duper profane words that you still can't say on broadcast television. And as George Carlin would say, the one beginning with F is the, what do you call it, the champion dirty word, the heavyweight champion of all dirty words. And that's probably something that certainly not in anytime soon do I think that broadcast television will be able to, actors in a broadcast TV show will be able to use the F word freely. So profanity, nudity is mostly a no-no. Although there have been some dramas. In the 90s, there was a show called NYPD Blue, which was a very successful and popular police drama that got away with it every once in a while. It wasn't oftentimes nudity that had anything to do with sexual situations. It was just occasionally you'd see somebody in the privacy of their own apartment or home walk around naked. Briefly. But for some reason, the FCC kind of looked the other way on that. But for the most part, no explicit nudity, no explicit sexual situations. Violence, you know, nothing too excessive, although I think that American audiences are more accepting of violence than they are of sexual situations and nudity. And really, it does kind of come down to what an American audience is more accepting of. Because it is the audiences that complain to the FCC that gets the FCC to take some sort of action. So again, broadcasting, they're the ones that really have to worry about the FCC. Because again, broadcast TV and radio are using the public waves of that wonderful electromagnetic spectrum that I showed you at the end of class on Friday. But there is some leeway I mean, still, you don't ever really hear excessive profanity or see excessive nudity on broadcast television. But I don't know. I'm sure some of you have woken up at 2 in the morning with a bit of insomnia and maybe flipped through channels and seen a movie on a broadcast network that could be an R-rated movie, and perhaps they haven't done as much editing to the movie as you thought they should. Well, sometimes the time of day, or better yet, the time of early morning or late night, also determines how much editing a network has to do to their movies or television shows. But again, it's because these broadcast networks and broadcast radio stations are serving the public interest to inform and entertain. And their main goal is to not show anything that the average citizen would find offensive. Now, obviously, you can listen to that statement and go, well, who's the average citizen? And what I find offensive, you may not. What you find offensive, I may not. Well, that term, community standards or public interest, especially the community standards one, is often evolving. Sometimes it's slow to evolve, but it's often evolving. And certainly what is allowed on TV, in even broadcast TV in 2020, is much different than what was allowed on broadcast TV in the early 90s, early 80s, and most definitely 60s. You never once heard Andy Griffith or I Love Lucy swear, although I'm sure they wanted to, because there were some very strange situations on that show, tense situations. But that would have been a violation of those community standards in the 1960s. And in fact, as some of you might know, even actors who played married couples on TV shows could not share a bed. If you like those old I Love Lucy shows, Lucy and Ricky, not only were they married on the show, they were married in real life. I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, who played her husband Ricky, they were married in real life and married on the show, and they still couldn't share a bed together when they had scenes, and their show took place in a small apartment. There was the kitchen, there was the living room, and there was the bedroom. And any shots in the bedroom of them first waking up in the morning or going to bed at night, they were in separate beds, little twin beds. So to have a couple, even a married couple, in the same bed was a violation of community standards back in the 60s. Let's change the aspect ratio standard for movies. I'm sure they did, Audrey. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So there is the official description of what the FCC does. So they don't, when it says cable there, they don't necessarily regulate cable content, because you can certainly get away with more on cable than you can on broadcast television, because you are paying for cable, you are paying extra. It's not part of the public airwaves, so to speak. It's something you have to subscribe to and pay a monthly fee for. So the idea goes that if you're subscribing to something, going out of your way to subscribe to something and paying a monthly fee, then you can, as a broadcaster, get away with a little bit more. But still, most of cable TV is not risque at all. You might hear a few more profane words drop on some cable networks. You might see movies on some cable networks that are R-rated movies that don't have the R parts, edited out of them, maybe some brief nudity. But for the most part, it's not like cable television is that risque, that obscene, that indecent. Why is that? If the FCC doesn't really regulate its content, and what the FCC does regulate with cable is just, we've talked about how cable companies can be looked at as having a monopoly, as I've said many times and complained about many times. If you want cable in this area, you have to do Suddenlink. And by the way, my Suddenlink experience has been resolved nicely. I spent 48 minutes on the phone Friday with somebody, and they sent somebody out Saturday, and everything has been fixed. And turns out I have cable now, and I don't even have to pay for it. My condo complex pays for it. So I suddenly love Suddenlink. Suddenlink and I are BFFs. Of course, we'll see in another month when I get my next bill. But right now, we're cool. But still, it's kind of a monopoly when you look at it. And what the FCC will do in order to make sure that a company like Suddenlink or Comcast, Xfinity, Cox, to make sure that they don't exert too much power, is they will make sure that a company like Suddenlink doesn't charge outrageous fees. That even though if you want cable in a particular region, this region, you have to do Suddenlink. When I lived in Louisiana, it was Cox. When I lived in West Virginia, it was Xfinity. You have to subscribe to that particular company. But Xfinity's prices aren't going to be so much more outrageous than Cox or Suddenlink. They're all going to be about the same. Now, certainly there's going to be discrepancies depending on what city, what state, cost of living, all of that. But if you pay $100 a month for cable with Suddenlink, the FCC wants to make sure that you're not paying $500 a month in New Orleans if you have Cox. But the content itself, they don't really care much about, because again, you're paying that. Yeah, well, 40 minutes was much better than the hour and a half I spent on the phone with him. I'll start singing Simon and Garfunkel now. Hello, darkness. So my question was, why then is cable TV, most cable channels, why are they relatively tame? If they don't have the FCC breathing down their necks as far as content goes, why don't we have more sex and nudity and profanity? Well, because, first of all, the folks who still have cable are probably of a middle age or older demographic, and they would probably be the first folks to complain if there was outrageous material. And really, cable, they're worried about advertisers as well. And advertisers aren't going to want to pay you if you have really obscene material or risque material, because they figure most audiences aren't going to be interested in that. So even though cable could get away with a little bit more, they don't really want to, because they don't want to, you know, move away advertisers and move away viewers. So let's say that somebody screws up. Let's say that there's accidentally a profane word spoken on a live telecast. And again, the FCC is not going to really do much until folks start complaining. It used to be they'd have to call the FCC hotline, and now you just go to the FCC website. There's the link right there if you want to go to the FCC and complain about anything. But the FCC doesn't necessarily go after NBC or CBS, the broadcast companies themselves. They go after the affiliates. They go after the little guy. Because again, it is the little station like KBTX, KAGS, that apply to the FCC for the license. And most of the time, if it's something accidental, somebody missed an edit button, a bleep button, you get a little slap on the wrist. But if it's something egregious, something major, you decide to play an entire movie with that's R-rated movie without editing it. Oftentimes this happens in radio. Local radio stations will play a stand-up comedy routine. We'll have an interview with a comedian that lasts for an hour or so, or a musician who just loves dropping the F-bomb, and they don't do a very good job of editing it. If it's prolonged like that, then they'll probably get a fine. Again, these are the local TV stations and local radio stations. Now, if it's content that is coming down from corporate, and NBC, ABC, CBS, a lot of their content comes from their big stations in New York or LA. So WNBC in New York, If it's something that comes down from corporate, then they'll probably go after the big TV stations. But for the most part, if somebody in Bryan or College Station registers a complaint with the FCC about something they saw on our local NBC or CBS affiliates here, it's our local affiliates that get punished somehow. And again, if it's a small mistake, probably get a slap on the wrist. Yeah.
Would they go after them for certain things, but they just don't care because they have money to fight off like the lawsuit or the fine? So I know that like some people will like injury insurance is like they'll just pay the whatever they can do because it's easier just to throw money at it than
To settle instead of go to court?
yeah. So is that like what they do as well? They're just like, okay, here's the fine, but we showed the movie anyway. Like it's a rated R movie and they showed everything.
So the question is, will stations show something even though they know they're going to get fined and just be...
Or the parent, like, if the parent's like here, and then if any of them get fined, it's like, here's the fine.
I think the big parent company could, yeah. So I've brought Howard Stern up on a couple of occasions in this class, and you know, back when he was on broadcast radio, and I listened to him for a year or two while I lived in Boston. His station was from I mean, he broadcast from New York, but his show ran live on Boston radio stations too. And he was actually very, very, very cautious of swear words. If one of his guests or one of his colleagues swore on the air, he would you know, jump on them live on radio and chew them out. So he was very cautious about that. But you know, there was a lot more that folks found offensive about the Howard Stern show than just the occasional use of profanity. He talked about sexual situations a lot. And I think the parent radio company and NBC realized we're making so much money off this guy that whatever fines we get, you know, we're still going to be in the black at the end of the year because we're making a lot more money off him than we're having to pay in fines. Yeah. So we keep talking about media markets, or I've talked about media markets. What is a media market? So the big time radio and TV stations are often in New York and LA because they are the major media markets here in the US. New York is 1, LA is 2. And what this means as an entire geographic region, so not just the city itself, because as you can see, Houston is number 8. And Houston is actually the 4th largest city in the country, but it's the 8th largest market. Houston is bigger than Dallas, but the Dallas-Fort Worth market is bigger than Houston because obviously it includes Dallas and Fort Worth and Plano and Garland and Arlington and Irving and, you know, all of those other places. And I watched some football yesterday. It's hard to watch football when there's no audience. It was a weird experience. I don't think I like it. I don't think I like anything about this year. It's a very controversial statement to make. I know 2020 has been terrible. Yeah. But yeah, but they had the big Sunday night game last night. It was from the new stadium in Los Angeles. And for a good 20 or 25 years, there was no NFL team in LA. And, you know, a lot of owners said, well, we have to change that. It's our 2nd largest media market, and to have no professional football is, and now they have 2 teams that are going to share one humongous stadium. And I'm sorry to all the Cowboy fans out there, but that new stadium in Los Angeles is, I think Jerry Jones is going to be a bit jealous. He's probably going to tear down Jerry's World and build something even bigger than the stadium they have in LA now. It looks like, I don't know, it looks like a space city you'd see on Star Trek or Rick and Morty or something like that. It doesn't even look like a football stadium anymore. Lovely Waco, Temple, and Bryan is number 82. What does that mean? Well, 82 is not bad, actually, because there are well over 300 media markets in the US. But oftentimes, if you have ever caught yourself watching local news that comes out of Waco, you might notice a mixture of much older news anchors, folks who've just decided, you know what, I'm in my 50s or 60s or 70s now, and Waco is where I live, and I don't really want to move. And then opposite them, very, very, very young news anchors and meteorologists and sports anchors just starting out, like folks in their 20s, fresh out of college. And that's because most journalists, most local reporters, TV reporters, usually start at stations in smaller markets. So you would start in Waco, Temple, Bryan, and hopefully you'd move up to Austin. More than likely you'd go from Waco, Temple, Bryan to, I don't know, some place in the 60s or 50s. But you'd eventually try to move up to higher markets because obviously more pay, more people watching you. But again, the major headquarters, major radio stations and TV stations of ABC, CBS, and NBC, generally in New York and Los Angeles. Yeah, the Cowboys should start winning before they tear down a perfectly good stadium, but you know what? It didn't stop the Texas Rangers, did it? Didn't stop the Atlanta Braves. I don't know. Anymore, once a stadium gets 15 years old, apparently it's time to tear it down and build a new one, which I guess I understand. It's all business. Yeah, there's like... Yeah, which is like 10 miles outside of town. Yeah. And I know a lot of arenas are outside of the city limits, but I love going to a... Oh, I know. I've made that drive from San Antonio to Austin. It took me like 9.5 hours. Yeah. Yep. But no, there's just something about going to a game that has, with a team that has an arena or a ballpark downtown, in their downtown part. That's just kind of cool to me. All right, I think this might be a good place to stop. We got some... Well, are we going to have fans at Kyle Field this year? What's the decision on that? Do we know? So 25% capacity? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Because everyone was talking about Florida State this past weekend and how they were supposed to be at like 25% capacity, and it looked like the stadium was half full and everyone was standing next to each other. But that's Florida. So. Yeah, I don't know. This is going to be a weird season. Students have to pay much more simply to fund a stadium no one asked for. I feel like I have struck a nerve with this conversation. This would be a good place to stop. All right.